It really annoys me how obscure the War of Spanish Succession is. I mean, this is a war for the fate of Europe, with 700,000 deaths, epic battles, brilliant generals, and electrifying personalities. Had it gone differently, France would have likely taken over the majority of Europe, and world history would have taken a drastically different direction. However, it's been forgotten under the pile of European balance of power wars that people don't feel like remembering, because they were all fought by snooty aristocrats and itchy Whigs over the same battlefields in Belgium. But what if the War of Spanish Succession had gone differently? And how wildly differently would the world have turned out? That is the question of this alternate history. The central crux of the War of Spanish Succession was France. France was the wealthiest, most powerful, and possibly most advanced nation in Europe at the time. For a comparison, it had a population of 21 million, while England had 5 million and Spain 8 million. The rest of Europe was terrified and formed an alliance against France, which had been able to hold off France for 9 years. The alliance was built off England, the Netherlands, the Austrian Habsburgs, and Spain. The Spanish Empire had been in decline for more than 50 years, and the crown clearly showed it. The King of Spain was a sickly inbred creature who had a massive deformed jaw that allowed him to only barely speak and chew, alongside suffering uncontrollable premature ejaculation which prevented him from continuing his line. He was called Charles the Hexed because it was assumed that he must have been cursed to have ended up so terribly. After his death, the Austrians and French both had a good claim on the throne. Everyone knew the empire was in decline, and so before his death, the European parts of the empire were divided between the Austrians and the French. However, Charles didn't like having his empire divided before his death, and so when he died childless in 1700, he passed his empire in its entirety over to the French. This terrified the other European powers. The French had almost already conquered Europe, and with the addition of the Spanish Empire, this seemed like a fate waiting to come true. The other main European powers of England, Holland, and Austria allied against the French to prevent them from dominating Europe. The French had for the past few decades been fighting against the Dutch and the Spanish in the Low Countries, and had thus grown tired of going up against the heavy fortifications there. Instead, they decided to focus most of their energies in the defeat of Austria. The French plan was to march across the south of Germany to Vienna, and thus knock Austria out of the war, allowing Holland and England to become isolated. This was helped by Bavaria, the most important state of southern Germany being a French ally, as well as a revolt in Hungary against the Austrians. The French plan nearly worked. However, the English commander, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, was a military genius. The English army was fighting in the Low Countries, but he knew that the decisive campaign was in the south, so he was able to basically trick the Dutch army into following him south alongside his English one. They then met the French army at Blenheim, where he decisively beat the French army. This blunted the French advance. The war dragged on for a few more years, but France was on the defensive. But what if France had won at Blenheim? In this timeline, that does happen. The Allied army is brutally crushed by the French. The remnants of the English and Dutch armies flee north for survival, and the Austrians flee east to protect their homeland. The French continue to march towards Austria, going through Bavaria completely unhindered, and then marching into Austria. The rebellions in Hungary burn hotter as the French march towards Vienna. The Austrians, not known for having the best military in Europe, are crushed unaided, and France places a relative of the Austrian throne as a puppet. This would allow the French to puppet master the rotting, flaccid corpse that was the Holy Roman Empire. Hungary and Bohemia are given independent status, and so the Austrian Empire collapses. The Dutch then face the united strength of the Spanish and French empires. The French almost conquered the Netherlands just by themselves earlier in Louis XIV's reign, so with the Spanish Empire and without the distraction of Austria, Holland would likely be defeated as well. The Dutch army would also likely be sorely hurt from the defeat at Blenheim. The Dutch stadtholder, or leader, was currently the husband of the Queen of England, so England would continue the war even without Holland. The French, without a powerful enough navy to force a landing in the British Isles, would be unable to conquer the islands. This would continue until the Hanoverians would take the throne in 1714. With the German lands, the Hanoverians would not want to displease the dominant continental power of France, and so would make peace with the French. This peace would amount to agreeing to accept France as the dominant continental power. However, as Britain would remain the dominant naval power, they would be able to scoop up and conquer the Dutch Empire in areas like South Africa and Indonesia. This would have numerous results across history. Firstly, the Dutch colony in the Cape region of South Africa had only recently been founded in 1691. The Dutch really did not encourage settlement of Dutchmen in their colonies, and Holland had a fairly small population, large amounts of which went to defeating French and Spanish invasions. This is why no real region on Earth is called a New Holland. The British, meanwhile, were very different. I mean, look at most of Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and what used to be parts of Africa. The native population of the Cape of South Africa are wiped out by European diseases in the same way as the natives of Australia and the Americas. However, the Dutch landlords weren't able to get enough white labor, and so imported disease-tolerant Africans from further north. This would probably not happen in this timeline. The British would settle en masse in the Cape in the 18th century, like Australia and later New Zealand. Large parts of South Africa would be majority white in this timeline. The British would also steal the Dutch possessions in Indonesia, which would result in them becoming a British dominion. The Dutch really didn't develop the areas they conquered, using them as tools for short-term profit. The British were also exploitive, but they also developed the regions they conquered. Compare India to Indonesia. I'm going to get a ridiculous amount of flack from Indians for this, but the British gave India its borders, central government, law, modern military, sense of national unity, and science. Indonesia got very little from the Dutch, except its borders and some economic connections. In this timeline with the British, Indonesia would become a more important nation, perhaps even a regional power. Meanwhile, to return to Europe, the French domination would result in geopolitics grinding to a halt. France just blew up the many hundred-year-old European balance of power and became dominant. French culture would spread across the continent, so food and art would be significantly better in this timeline. The French in most cases would rule through subordinate client states with fortresses placed in strategic locations. Without Austria, and with Hungary being a decentralized backward state, the Ottoman Empire would take much longer to fall. The Russians would likely take a much larger bite out of the Ottoman Empire instead of having to balance their gains with the Austrians. Maybe the Ottomans with more time would be able to modernize and revive their empire. Two things would disturb this balance of power: Prussia and Russia. Prussia was a small German state that also happened to have the best military in Europe and one of the greatest military geniuses ever as their king. Russia was a massive behemoth that has dragged itself into the modern age by Peter the Great, and had just defeated its main rivals of Sweden and the Turks. The Russians and Prussians would edge against the French-dominated system and try to destroy it. When war would erupt between the British and French over the Ohio River Valley in America, the powder keg would explode in Europe. France would have found a way to organize a central army out of their client Germanic states into a central force, which would make them very powerful, although the sheer size of Russia and the sheer military genius of Frederick the Great would turn the tide. The Prussians would be allowed to keep Silesia, but besides that, the results would be inconclusive in Europe. In North America, the results are harder to predict. I can't see any direct way this timeline would have affected North America. On the other hand, a more powerful France could indirectly allow the French to keep control over their colonies in North America. The British only narrowly conquered New France in our timeline, and so some minor butterfly effect resulting from a powerful France could tilt the balance. I really can't tell what would happen. This is an issue since this theater of war is decisive to literally the rest of mankind's history, whether or not North America would speak French or English. I would hazard a guess that the French would keep their colonies in New France or Canada and the Great Lakes alongside Louisiana, while the British would gain the Ohio River Valley, simply due to American population pressure pouring across the mountains. The American Revolution is simply impossible to predict. The revolution didn't have to happen and was caused by the British messing up their American policy on a truly massive scale. There are too many unknowns. Would the British try to take a more conciliatory route against the Americans so to use them against the French? Maybe the Americans would still be worried by the threat of the French in the north, and so would stick with the British. Maybe exactly the same thing would happen. I don't know. The British would still defeat the French in India. The British were simply much more wealthy in India than the French, and with their naval superiority would still be able to conquer India. I can say there would be no French Revolution in Napoleon. With France the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth, the old French regime would never have imploded due to debts. There never would have been the massive vacuum that Napoleon entered into, and this has countless effects on history, ranging from the survival of the Spanish Empire to the survival of the Holy Roman Empire, but frankly this timeline has become so large and convoluted that I can't push it any further. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that timeline, please comment, subscribe, support me on Patreon, and stay tuned for future videos. Thank you very much for watching.